Hey guys, welcome back to the ES6 series. In this video, we're going to take a look at promises. So what are promises, you might ask? Well, a promise is basically a language construct in ES6 that's been added precisely for handling asynchronous operations. So in essence, a promise is simply an object that represents an operation that has not been executed yet. And the thing about promises is that when that promise object is returned, you can actually attach callbacks to that object instead of passing them into a function as you would typically do with traditional or old-style callbacks. Typically, you don't create promises by yourself. Promises are usually baked in libraries, like I said, jQuery, Ajax, or also Axios, or you might even see promises in libraries like Firebase. They're really all over the place, and like I said, typically you don't create them by yourself using the promise constructor. Most of the time, you are essentially a consumer of a library or a project that already has promises baked into it. In order to see the benefits of using promises, let's first look at an older style approach to handling asynchronous operations. And this style has been very popular, especially in Node.js environment. And the style I'm talking about is the callback functional style. So with callbacks, imagine that we want to execute a sequence of operations here. So for example, we might have a login function that expects an email as well as a password. Imagine that this function is going to create an Ajax request to a server, and the server is going to validate the email as well as the password, and then it's going to return a response, which is either going to be a success response, a 200 response. We might get the user object, or it could be an error response, in which case there was a problem with the email address or the password. So in order to continue execution after the server has sent a response back to the client, right, after the validation has been done, this function needs to expect another argument, which is going to be a success callback. So this function would be executed once the response from the server is returned. But because the response from the server could also be an error, so meaning that the request has failed, we also need to expect another callback, which would be a failure callback. So in fact, let's create this function right here. Let's do login and be an arrow function. We're going to expect a list of arguments like that. Okay, let's have an empty body for now. So once that function is called, like I said, we need to provide the email, the password, and in fact, let's do something like this. Let's do alex@gmail.com. That's not a valid email, of course. For the password, let's do simple pass 123. And then the success callback, like I said, it needs to be a function. So I'm going to use arrow functions here. And like I said, this function is going to execute whenever we get a successful response from the server. So you might imagine that this function, whenever we log in to the server might respond with the user object. So we might expect to receive a user object once the operation succeeds. But because there's a possibility that the operation might fail due to network problems, or simply because we provided an invalid email or password, like I said, we might also get an error. So we might have another callback with the error. Now for the error, there are multiple different ways to handle it, but one way to do it would be just to simply console log the error. And that's sufficient for this example. Okay, so once we get the user object, what we might want to do with the user object is, let's say, once we get the user, we want to load user profile. So that would be another function. In a similar fashion, this load user profile function would also expect a user that we get from the login function, right, once that function executes. But it's also going to expect a success callback as well as the error handler callback, right? And the success callback might return the profile object itself. And for the error, typically it would just be the error object. And in this example, we might just simply do console log the error. And then maybe lastly, the last thing you would want to do is, for example, once you get the profile, you also want to load profile posts, for instance, right? So you pass the profile, you pass the success callback, and in this case, we'll get the posts. It would be a function. We also have a error handler here. And in there, we would just do console log error. For the posts, we would do, let's just do simple console log posts. So we have three nested functions in here, right? Login, load user profile, and load profile posts. Now back to the login function. Because we don't have any server running here, I'm actually going to simulate the Ajax call by creating a simple set timeout. So this is going to create a timeout for us. We're going to provide a callback function, and this is going to execute after 1 second. So to simulate this call, I'm just going to say, let's say on the server, you might have a check if you have an email as well as a password. And of course, typically you would also validate that this email exists in the database and the password actually matches the hashed password that you have stored in the database. But let's say that we'll do a simple check. If we have the email as well as the password, we're going to execute the success callback function, right? And we're also going to pass a user object, which the success callback function expects. So in this case, the user object, let's say it might have an ID. So we might do date now, might also have a name. Let's do Alex. And for instance, we might also do the email, alex@gmail.com, okay? And then for the else condition, so if we did not provide the email as well as the password, we're just going to call the failure callback. And let's say we're going to pass a message that's going to say email and password are required, like so. Now let's create the second function here. So load user profile. It's also going to be an arrow function, load user profile. And that function is going to expect, let's see, for the argument list, it's going to expect the user, but it's also going to expect, again, you can see a pattern here. It's going to expect the success callback as well as the failure callback. And in a similar fashion, you would imagine that this would typically be an Ajax call. So I'm just going to set a timeout to simulate that server call. Let's set it to one second also. So in there we might have a check. So if you provided a user, in this example, you might imagine if you made an actual call and you provided the user object or the user ID inside of the request body. So we want to have that check. And of course, if you did not provide the user, we would need to call the failure callback. We might pass an error message saying that user is required. And then in the success callback, let's say we call the success callback here, we pass an object, that'll be the profile. So in there, let's say we might have a profile ID, some ID, and we might also have an image. So it might be a link to the image of the profile. For now, I'm just going to put some dummy data. And lastly, we also need to have our load profile post function, right? So I'm going to have that as well. And we're going to have a function that expects the profile, and it's also going to need to have the 2 callbacks as usual. Okay, so once we have that, I'm also going to set a timeout to simulate a network request. So let's provide a callback function. Let's also set it to 1 second. So it's going to execute after 1 second. And we're also going to have a check. So if you provided a profile, okay, we are just simply going to call the success callback, and we might want to pass an array of posts. So this will be an array of objects. And let's say for the first one, we might have an object with some kind of an ID. Just going to put 1 for now, and maybe title my post. And then for the second one, let's say we have an ID of 2. The title would be my awesome post. Okay, just some dummy data for now. And of course, we can't forget the error handler. So in this case, we would just call the failure callback. And I'm just going to, first of all, clear the log because it's already executing. But let's also put profile is required, something like that. And as you see right here, we get the output on the right. We get the object with the post. Okay. And for instance, if I remove the email address, you might expect an error to show up. We get email and password are required. Of course, the same thing would happen if I remove the password, right? We're going to get the same error as well. Let's see. There we go, the error. Now, of course, if I, for example, did not provide the user object, if I put, let's say, null for the user object, that's going to make the second function fail. So we're going to get in here, user is required. And as you might expect, if I don't provide a profile, if I just put null for that function, because it expects a profile in here, and we actually have a check for that profile, we're going to get an error message that says profile is required. So what was the purpose of showing this quite a complicated example where we had to log in first, then we wanted to load the user profile, and we wanted to load the post? Well, as you can see here, all of these actions are asynchronous, and that's why the output on the right actually happens with a bit of a delay. Every single action, every single function here executes after a 1 second timeout. And you can imagine that these functions would be part of some kind of an API that actually makes network requests. One of the flaws of this callback approach is that it becomes cumbersome to deal with nested or sequential asynchronous operations once every operation is scheduled to run after one another. So in this scenario, we basically end up nesting the callback functions inside of each callback that's being executed, right? And notice that in here, we sort of create like a pyramid of callbacks. And this long chain of deeply nested anonymous function is actually referred to as callback hell. And even though this approach works perfectly fine, eventually with more complicated, more advanced applications, it becomes really difficult to read through the code and track down the changes and see what exactly is going on at every single step. And this is where promises come in. So we're going to refactor this example using promises. First of all, instead of returning a function from login, I'm actually going to return a promise. So let's return a new promise object. And the promise is actually going to expect a function as well. Now, it's not going to be just any function. This function is going to receive two special arguments. One of them is going to be the resolve argument and the other one reject. Now, the way you name them is up to you, but the concept is that basically the first argument would be the function that executes in the success scenario, so everything went well, there was no errors. The second one executes whenever something erroneous or some failure happens. And this is similar to the success callback as well as the failure callback that we had to explicitly pass to the functions whenever we call them. So here, for example, I call the load user profile. Notice that I receive the user object, but I also have to pass a function that is going to receive the profile, and then it's also going to have some logic inside of it, right? This is going to be quite different with promises, as you're going to see in a few seconds. Let me just clear the log for now. And inside of that function, let's actually put back the set timeout call, okay? And instead of calling the success callback and a failure callback, we're actually going to call resolve. And we're also going to call reject, okay, like so. Remove those curly braces. Now, let's refactor the second one. So we have another callback style of function here. So instead of returning a function, we are going to return a promise here. And again, the promise is also going to have a similar shape. It's going to receive a function. Inside of that function, we're just going to put back the logic that we had before with the set timeout call. So let's just indent it a little bit. Let's remove the old braces. The same thing goes for load profile post. This is also going to return a promise. So we're just going to return new promise. And when we use the promise, it's basically using the promise constructor. So it's going to create a promise object. And the same goes in here. So we need to have a function that is going to receive resolve as well as reject. And on the same note, of course, we have to replace success callback with resolve and also failure callback with reject, because that's how we call the parameters. Like I said, you can call them whatever you want, but basically the convention is to use resolve and reject across the board. And inside of that function, we're going to put back the set timeout. So the logic didn't actually change. It's going to be the same, but we also have to replace, of course, resolve and reject, like so. Now, the way that you handle promises is also going to change. So before, notice that we had to call each function sequentially, right? And we also had to pass the arguments. So the login function expects an email as well as a password. But that function also needs a callback function. So everything in here in the body of the function that's going to execute after the login function finishes. And we also had to provide the error handler because that function might fail due to network requests, like I said, or because the email was invalid or the password was invalid, or even if we didn't provide the email or the passwords altogether. And you can already see that we had to copy the error handlers for every single function that we executed. So in every function, we had to provide the success callback, for example, here with the user object, the profile object, the post, but every time we also had to provide the error handler as well, which is not very efficient. And that's quite different with promises. So with promises, instead of doing it with the old style functional or callback approach where you actually had to pass the callbacks as arguments to the function, in this example, the only two arguments are going to be the email and the password. And of course, this is going to change the signature of those functions. I forgot to update them. So we no longer need to accept the success callback and the failure callback. We're just going to accept the in this example, for the login, we need email and password. For logging the profile, we need the user, and for logging post, we need the profile. Okay. And instead of actually passing those callbacks as argument functions, we're going to nest another function call here. And this is going to be then function. This function is going to receive an argument that is going to be another function, a callback essentially. So in this example, once we log in, we can expect to have a function that accepts the user, right? So we're going to have a function that accepts a user, and then you have some processing logic inside of it. Let's indent this like so. So we get a function that accepts the user, and we're going to get the user object, and then we can continue doing whatever we wanted to do afterwards. Now, what about the error handler? There are two ways to handle it. One way would be to add another function, and this function would accept the error. And then, of course, inside of that function, we could just simply do console log that error. Okay? And that's one way to handle it. Let's just keep it that way for now. I'm going to show you other ways as well. Now, after that, once we get the user object, we can also call load user profile function. Okay? That function is going to accept the user. Now, after that load user profile function executes, we can have another then call. Okay? And that function, that then nested call, is also going to expect another callback. In this example, we're going to have a callback that gives us a profile, and then we can continue the logic inside of it. Now, like I said, you can also copy the error handler as well and put it in there. But in this case, it sort of becomes tedious, and you're again duplicating the error handlers. There's actually a simpler way to handle it. So instead of putting the error handler as a second argument, you could actually have another clause that's going to be called as catch. And inside of that catch, you're just basically going to pass another callback. That callback is going to expect an error. In this example, just a string, a message, and it's going to console log that error. And you can have just one single catch clause that's going to be at the end of your then clauses. And of course, once we get the profile, we can call the function load profile posts. Okay, we're going to pass the profile, and once that function executes, we're going to have a then clause, which is going to expect the posts. And finally, once we get a post, we can just console log those posts. Okay, and of course, all of that other stuff is going to be gone. And as you can see here, we actually get undefined, and that's because we need to return the result of that function for every function that we call. So in this example, actually, because we just have a simple operation, I'm just going to take advantage of the implicit return keyword. I'm just going to put the function call on the same line, removing the curly braces. I'm going to do the same for the profile as well. So I'm just going to bring it on a single line, and I'm going to do the same for post because we just want to console log them out. So you end up with a structure that looks something like this. So you can see that we get the same results as before. We get the two post objects on the right. This is the exact same call as we had before, but this approach is actually shorter to write and it's easier to follow. So in this example, we're calling the login function with the email as well as the password, right? Once that function executes, then we want to execute another function. This callback function is going to receive the user object. Why, you might ask? Well, the user object is returned from the resolved call that we did inside of the promise. So if everything goes well, if you provided the email as well as the password, this condition succeeds. It's true. And that's why we want to resolve with an object, essentially a user object that contains an ID and name as well as the email. So that user object is being returned to this callback function. And once we get the user, we execute load user profile. Once that function executes, then we want to call another callback. That callback is going to load profile post with the profile, and after that, then we're going to lastly call another function that's just going to console log the post. And lastly, if anything fails, we're just going to use the error handler function or callback here. This style of using callbacks is known as asynchronous function call. So instead of passing callbacks as arguments to the function, as we did with the old style callbacks, in each and every function, we basically create a promise object. So here we have a promise object. We create it using a constructor, the same for load user profile and load profile post. So we create promise objects, and once that promise object is returned, we can actually attach callbacks to that promise. So in this scenario, we attach the then call to that promise that's returned from the login function, right? And we do it for every single function here, for login, for load user profile, and load profile post. And essentially what we end up doing is we create a chain of then calls. This chain is also known as promise chain. And the thing to note here is that every single then call is going to return a new promise that is going to be rejected or resolved after the callback finishes execution. So the first then call is going to execute only after the login function succeeds. The second then is going to execute not only after login function succeeds, but also after this then call or the load user profile call succeeds. And as you might imagine, the third then is also going to execute after login function succeeds, after the load user profile succeeds, and after load profile posts also succeeds. I already pointed out that before we had to provide error handlers for every single function that we called, along with the success callback. Well, in this scenario, we just have one catch clause that is going to catch all sorts of errors. So if anything down the road fails, for example, something fails in the login function or in load user profile function, or for that matter in load profile posts, if any failure happens, it's always going to be passed down to the catch handler, error handler. And in this scenario, it's just basically going to be logged to the console. So as you can see here, the advantages is that we get a chain of callback functions, which basically makes it more readable for us because it allows us to have multiple then calls that run asynchronously one after another one. And unlike callbacks, we never actually go more than one level deep. So everything is sort of like flattened and it's just easier to read. Now, the promise object also has a few static methods. One of them is all, and essentially it accepts an array of promises such that when all of the promises are resolved, you're just going to execute a single callback, basically when everything finishes successfully. And if anything fails, well, as you might expect, it's going to go to the catch clause, for which you have to provide your own callback. And another static method that I'm just going to mention is also race. So race is similar, except that it's going to execute once one of the promises is resolved. So you might have an array of several promises, but once one of them succeeds, it's going to execute whatever you pass to the then function. So the callback that you pass in there is going to execute once one of the promises is resolved. So that's basically it for promises. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and we're going to continue with generators in the next one. So I hope to see you there. Bye bye.